Nobody thinks of themselves as someone who begs. That's the funniest part. They think of themselves as loyal, patient, as someone who loves deeply and doesn't give up easily. They have a whole internal narrative about what kind of person they are. Generous, understanding, emotionally mature. And they're not lying. They genuinely believe it. They just can't explain why their chest tightens every time their phone goes quiet. There's a specific type of person this book is for. They're competent in almost every area of their life. Functional. Probably impressive to most people who know them. And yet, in one particular room, the room where someone they want is standing, they become someone else entirely. Someone smaller, someone careful. Someone who has learned, through long practice, to need very little out loud. That careful person is not weak. That's important to understand before we go any further. The careful person is actually quite skilled. They've developed a sophisticated internal system for reading rooms, managing impressions, and calibrating exactly how much of themselves is safe to show. It took years to build. It runs automatically. And it is quietly destroying them. Here is the psychology of it in plain language. At some point, usually early, usually in a context you didn't choose, you learned that love was not a given. It was a response. Something that came when you behaved correctly, needed little, performed adequately. You absorbed this lesson the way children absorb everything, completely, wordlessly, and without filing it under lessons I probably shouldn't keep. So you kept it. And it followed you into every room, every relationship, every moment where someone's approval suddenly felt essential. Not because you were desperate, because your nervous system had a very old, very firm belief. The way to stay connected is to be worth keeping. That belief is the engine behind every behavior this book is going to name. The over-explaining, the fast replies, the tolerance of things that shouldn't be tolerated, the performance of being fine when you are spectacularly not fine. None of it is weakness. All of it is cost. This book is not a self-help book in the traditional sense. It won't ask you to love yourself in the mirror or write down 5 things you're grateful for. It's going to do something slightly less comfortable. It's going to show you exactly what you've been doing, why you've been doing it, and what it's actually been costing you, in language precise enough to be uncomfortable. Because the goal isn't to feel better about the pattern. The goal is to see it clearly enough that continuing it becomes genuinely difficult. You're not here to beg for love. You never were. You just got confused somewhere along the way, which, given what you were working with, was almost inevitable. Let's figure out where it started. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. It's always interesting to see where this reaches. Chapter 1. The Disguise. Begging for love doesn't look like begging. That's the whole problem. Picture this. A woman sits across from a man who has canceled on her 3 times this month. She's not crying. She's not raising her voice. She's nodding slowly, her face arranged into something that looks remarkably like understanding, while internally she is running complex calculations about what she can say that won't make him feel criticized. She leaves the conversation having communicated nothing true. She calls this being mature. That's what begging looks like in the wild. It doesn't arrive with tears and dramatic pleas. It arrives wearing patience. It arrives wearing flexibility, understanding, low maintenance, emotionally evolved. It has excellent posture and a very reasonable tone of voice. and it spends a significant amount of energy making sure nobody, least of all the person it's performing for, suspects that anything is wrong. This is the disguise, and it's remarkably effective, which is exactly the problem. Because if begging looked like begging, you'd stop. Nobody wants to be the person on their knees. But begging that looks like generosity? That looks like love? That looks like the kind of mature, selfless, emotional intelligence people write articles about? That's a different situation entirely. You can sustain that for years, decades even. You can build an entire identity around it. The clinical term for this pattern involves words like anxious attachment and emotional regulation and nervous system dysregulation. The human term is simpler. You learn to want things quietly. Wanting things quietly is a skill. It develops in environments where wanting things loudly produced bad outcomes. Tension, withdrawal, disappointment, that particular parental silence that somehow said everything. So you adapted. You got good at reading the temperature of a room before you said anything real in it. You got good at pre-editing yourself, removing the parts that might be too much. And here is what nobody tells you about that skill. It transfers. Whatever you learned to do in that original environment, you will do in every environment that feels similar. Different person, same room. Different relationship, same calculation. The faces change. The dynamic stays remarkably consistent. I once watched a friend, intelligent, professionally successful, genuinely funny, spend 45 minutes composing a single text message. Not because the message was complicated, because he was terrified of sounding like he cared too much. He sent something casual. She didn't respond for 2 hours. He spent those 2 hours narrating his own spiral out loud to me. When she finally replied, he exhaled like a man who had been underwater. The message had 3 words. The performance around it had cost him most of an afternoon. That's the thing about the disguise. It doesn't just hide the begging from other people. It hides it from you. You're not begging. You're just being thoughtful about how you communicate. You're not shrinking, you're just picking your battles. You're not afraid, you're just patient. The words are all reasonable. The feelings underneath are not. Here is the psychological reality. The moment you start editing yourself to manage someone else's reaction to you, you have handed them something. Not consciously, not intentionally, but functionally, you have placed your sense of stability outside yourself and inside their response. Now their silence is a verdict. Their warmth is a reprieve. Their distance is a sentence. That is not connection. That is surveillance. And surveillance is exhausting. It keeps your nervous system in a low-grade state of readiness, scanning, calculating, interpreting. You never fully relax because relaxing would mean dropping the performance. And dropping the performance feels genuinely dangerous, even when it isn't. The most precise way to say it is this: begging is what happens when you need someone's behavior to tell you that you're okay. Once you see it that way, you'll start recognizing it everywhere. In the fast reply you send even when you're busy. In the conflict you absorb instead of naming. In the way you frame your needs as questions. Your disappointments as nothing. Your limits as flexible. Always flexible. Because flexible feels safer than clear. You're not doing this because you're weak. You're doing this because at some point it worked, and the nervous system doesn't unlearn things that once kept it safe. But here's what begging costs, beyond the obvious. Every time you edit yourself to keep someone comfortable, you confirm a belief you didn't choose to have. The belief that your unedited self is too much, or not enough, or in some configuration that requires management before it's safe to show. And that belief, rehearsed daily, reinforced constantly, quietly becomes your operating system. You stop trusting your instincts. You override your discomfort. You silence the part of you that knows, and it always knows, that something is off. That voice doesn't disappear. It gets quieter. And the quieter it gets, the more lost you become. Not dramatically, just incrementally. One small edit at a time. The disguise is good. That's the last thing to say about it. It fools other people. It fools you. It comes with an entire supporting cast of virtues, patience, loyalty, emotional generosity, that make it almost impossible to criticize. Who wants to be told their greatest strength is actually a wound in formal wear? But a wound in formal wear is still a wound. And the first step to treating it is calling it what it is. Chapter 2. The Training. You didn't come up with this on your own. That's the first thing to understand. Nobody sits down at age 7 and decides, I'm going to develop a sophisticated system for suppressing my needs in exchange for conditional approval. That would require a level of strategic self-awareness that most adults don't have, let alone children. What actually happens is simpler, less dramatic, and significantly harder to undo. You were trained, not deliberately, almost never deliberately. The people who trained you were mostly doing their best with what they had, which was whatever they'd been trained with, by people who were also doing their best, stretching back further than anyone can usefully trace. This is not a chapter about blame. Blame is psychologically satisfying for about 10 minutes, and then it just becomes another thing to carry. This is a chapter about mechanics. Here is how the training works. A child's nervous system is not equipped to evaluate environments. It is equipped to adapt to them. This is a feature, not a bug. It's how humans survived long enough to develop the kind of attachment issues we're currently discussing. The child doesn't ask, is this healthy? The child asks, what do I need to do to stay connected? And then it does that thing, reliably, repeatedly, until it becomes automatic. If love in your house was consistent, warm, available, not contingent on your performance, your nervous system learned something like, I am welcome here. I don't need to earn this. That's a good foundation. People who have it often can't explain why they're not more anxious in relationships. They just aren't. But if love was inconsistent, if it arrived sometimes and withdrew at others, if it came with conditions that were never quite made explicit, if the emotional temperature of the house shifted in ways that felt unpredictable and therefore required constant monitoring, your nervous system learned something different. It learned to stay alert, not because alertness was chosen, because alertness was useful. You got good at reading faces before you could fully read words. You learned to feel the shift in a room before anything was said. You developed what people sometimes call emotional sensitivity, which sounds like a gift, and sometimes is and is also the direct result of growing up in an environment where missing a signal had consequences. That sensitivity followed you here, into this conversation, into every relationship you've had since childhood. You are, in many ways, still scanning the same room. It just has different furniture now. I grew up in a house where tension announced itself before the door was fully open. You could hear it in footsteps. I became very good at knowing, within about 4 seconds of someone walking in, what kind of evening it was going to be. I thought this was intuition. It was training. Here is where it gets specific. There are a few particular lessons that produce the begging pattern in adults. They don't always look like lessons. They usually look like ordinary childhood experiences, but they leave marks. The first is intermittent reinforcement. This is the psychological mechanism behind slot machines, and also behind some of the most destabilizing relationships you've ever had. When love, attention, warmth, approval arrives unpredictably, the brain doesn't conclude that the source is unreliable. It concludes that the source is extremely valuable and must be pursued harder. Inconsistency doesn't register as a reason to disengage. It registers as a reason to try more. This is not a personality flaw. It is a neurological response that researchers have documented extensively and that casinos have been exploiting professionally for decades. The hot and cold person you once couldn't stop thinking about wasn't fascinating. They were a slot machine, and you had been trained, long before you met them, to pull the lever. The second lesson is conditional approval. This is subtler. It doesn't require anyone to be cruel. It simply requires that approval, praise, warmth, connection, arrives more reliably when you behave in certain ways. When you're helpful, when you don't make demands, when you keep the peace, when you need very little. Over time, the child connects the dots, not consciously, neurologically. This version of me is safer, and they start producing that version automatically, whenever safety feels relevant, which eventually is almost always. The third lesson is the cost of honesty. In some houses, expressing real feelings, anger, disappointment, need, produced outcomes that were worse than the original feeling. Conflict, withdrawal, guilt, emotional escalation. So feelings went underground, not because they stopped existing, but because showing them was calculated correctly to be more expensive than hiding them. The child learned to manage their inner world privately and present something smoother to the outside. That child is now an adult who is very good at saying "I'm fine" and meaning something entirely different. None of these lessons required anyone to be monstrous. That's the uncomfortable part. Most of the training was delivered by ordinary people in ordinary moments. A distracted parent, an emotionally unavailable one, a household where feelings were simply not the primary language. Nobody sat you down and said your needs are inconvenient. They just responded that way enough times, in enough moments, for the message to land without words. And here is what makes this particularly difficult to undo. The training doesn't feel like training. It feels like personality. It feels like just how you are, someone who doesn't make a fuss, who adapts easily, who is good in a crisis, who people always describe as so understanding. These feel like traits. They are, in large part, strategies. Strategies that formed before you had any say in the matter and have been running ever since on something close to autopilot. Seeing this clearly is not comfortable. It tends to produce a specific kind of vertigo. The feeling of looking at something you thought was just you and realizing it has a history, a cause, a shape you didn't choose. That vertigo is worth tolerating. Because you can't revise a pattern you can't see. And you can't see a pattern you've mistaken for your personality. The training was real. The lessons landed. And they are not permanent, but they are sticky. And they will not unstick through willpower or positive thinking, or deciding to simply be different. They unstick through understanding exactly what was learned, and then, slowly, repeatedly, in real moments, learning something else. That's the work. It's not dramatic. It doesn't happen all at once, but it starts here, with this. Whatever you learned about love in that first room was not the truth about love. It was the truth about that room. You are no longer in that room. Even when it feels like you are. You're still here. 2 chapters in, that's not nothing. Most people who clicked this video moved on before they got uncomfortable. You didn't. Which means something in here is hitting close enough to stay. If that's the case, subscribe. Not because this channel needs it, because the next time you want this kind of thinking, you'll want to find it without looking for it. That's all. Back to the part that actually matters. On Chapter 3, the addiction that isn't about love. You are not addicted to the person. You are addicted to the 3 seconds after they respond. That's the whole thing. That's the entire mechanism. Everything else, the obsessive checking, the spiral when they go quiet, the disproportionate relief when a message finally arrives, is just the addiction doing what addictions do, making itself look like something more meaningful than it is. This is not a metaphor. The neuroscience is fairly literal. When your nervous system has learned to locate its sense of safety in external validation, the arrival of that validation triggers a measurable release of dopamine. Not a large one, not a lasting one. Just enough to interrupt the anxiety briefly before the anxiety reconstitutes itself and the cycle begins again. This is the same fundamental loop behind gambling, social media engagement, and the particular torture of waiting for a specific person to text you back. The brain is not asking, "Do I love this person?" The brain is asking, "When is the next hit coming?" Which is uncomfortable to hear. Most people prefer to frame it as depth of feeling. I just care so much. And the caring may be real. But caring and craving are not the same thing, and confusing them is how you end up 6 months into a relationship that makes you feel consistently terrible. Telling yourself it must be love, because nothing has ever made you feel this bad before. Pain is not a measurement of love. It's a measurement of activation. And some nervous systems are extremely activated by exactly the kind of person who is least equipped to actually love them. Here is how to tell the difference between love and the addiction pretending to be love. Love is relatively calm. Not boring, calm. It has a kind of baseline steadiness that doesn't require constant maintenance. You can go a few hours without contact and not enter a low-grade crisis. You can receive a shorter than usual message and not spend 40 minutes analyzing its implications. You can disagree without your nervous system treating it as a 5-alarm emergency. The addiction is not calm. The addiction is a constant low hum of monitoring. Is everything okay? Did that mean something? Why haven't they? Okay, they responded. Okay. Good. Okay. That relief lasts approximately as long as it takes to read the message, and then the monitoring resumes. I spent the better part of a year in that loop with someone I was convinced I loved deeply. When it ended, the withdrawal was real, restless, disorienting, genuinely painful. What I did not expect was what came after the withdrawal. Not grief, exactly. More like the particular silence of a fire alarm that has finally stopped. I hadn't realized how loud it had been until it wasn't. That silence was the first honest thing I'd felt in months. The addiction operates through a very specific psychological mechanism called variable reinforcement, which we touched on in the last chapter, and which deserves more attention here because it is, genuinely, one of the most powerful behavioral traps that exists. Variable reinforcement means the reward, warmth, attention, responsiveness, arrives unpredictably. Sometimes after 1 message, sometimes after 10. Sometimes after a silence that lasts long enough to make you question everything. The unpredictability is not incidental to the addiction. It is the addiction. A consistent person, someone reliably warm, reliably present, reliably engaged, does not produce the same neurological response. The brain habituates. The dopamine spike flattens. What remains is something that feels, to a nervous system trained on inconsistency, almost boring. This is why emotionally unavailable people feel magnetic. Not because they are more interesting, because they are less predictable. And unpredictability, to a nervous system that learned love was something you had to catch at the right moment, feels exactly like excitement. It isn't excitement. It's anxiety wearing excitement's clothes. The practical consequence of this is that your instincts about attraction are not fully trustworthy. This is a difficult thing to accept, particularly if you pride yourself on self-awareness. But the pull you feel towards someone is partly chemistry, and partly neurology, and partly a very old pattern looking for a familiar shape to attach to. The person who makes you feel most alive in the early stages of connection is often the person whose behavior most closely resembles the original environment that produced the pattern. You are not drawn to them because they're right for you. You are drawn to them because they feel familiar. And familiar is not the same as good. Familiar is just recognizable. Here is where the addiction becomes genuinely costly. When your sense of okayness depends on someone else's behavior, you cannot be a fair witness to the relationship. Everything gets filtered through the question of whether you're still safe, still wanted, still chosen, still acceptable. This makes real assessment almost impossible. You can't accurately evaluate whether someone is good for you when your nervous system is too busy managing the anxiety of potentially losing them, so you stay longer than you should. You rationalize what shouldn't be rationalized. You perform the psychological equivalent of staring directly at something and deciding not to see it. Because seeing it would mean confronting a loss that feels, in the moment, unsurvivable. It is survivable. It is always survivable. The nervous system doesn't know that, but it's true. The beginning of getting free from this particular addiction is not finding a better person to attach to. That's just a transfer. The beginning is learning to generate enough internal stability that the absence of external validation doesn't register as an emergency. This is not a skill you develop through insight alone. Insight is the map. The actual work is tolerating the discomfort of not reaching, not texting back immediately, not seeking the reassurance, not resolving the ambiguity, and surviving it. Repeatedly. Until the nervous system updates its information. The information it needs to update is simple. I am okay even when they haven't responded. My worth is not contingent on their attention. The silence is not a verdict. These sentences sound simple. Believing them, in the body, not just the mind, takes time and repetition and a willingness to sit with discomfort that most people, trained since childhood to avoid exactly this discomfort, find genuinely difficult. But here's the thing about getting clean from this particular addiction. The other side of it is not emptiness. It's not coldness or indifference or the gray flatness people sometimes associate with not caring. The other side of it is a quieter, steadier form of connection. One where you can actually see the person in front of you, because you're no longer too busy managing your own anxiety to look. That kind of connection is less intense. It is also significantly more real. And real, it turns out, is what you were looking for all along. You just got handed a very convincing imitation first. Chapter 4: Attachment versus Choice. Here is a question most people have never actually asked themselves about their most significant relationships. Did I choose this? Or did I just never leave? Those are not the same thing. They feel similar from the inside, which is the problem. Both involve staying. Both can involve genuine feeling. But one is an active decision made from a place of clarity, and the other is the absence of a decision, a kind of default continuation that gets mistaken for commitment, because commitment and inertia look identical until something forces you to tell them apart. Most people, if they're honest, have spent significant portions of their relational lives in the second category. Not choosing, just not leaving. And calling it love because love was the most available word. Attachment is not love. This is the central distinction this chapter exists to make, and it's worth sitting with before moving past it. Attachment is what happens when your nervous system bonds to a source of regulation. When someone's presence, their warmth, their attention, their availability, becomes part of how you manage your internal state, you become attached to them the way you become attached to anything that reliably affects how you feel. This can happen with people who are wonderful for you. It can also happen with people who are genuinely harmful. The nervous system is not discriminating. It bonds to what's consistent or to what's intermittently reinforcing, which, as we've established, produces an even stronger bond. The quality of the relationship is almost irrelevant to the strength of the attachment. This is why people stay in relationships that are clearly not working and feel, with complete sincerity, that they cannot leave. They're not lying. They genuinely feel that way. But what they're feeling is not love holding them there. It's attachment. And attachment, when threatened, produces something that functions almost identically to a survival response. Your body cannot tell the difference between I might lose this person and I might not survive. It responds to both with the same basic alarm, which is why a relationship ending can feel, neurologically, like a genuine emergency, even when the rational part of you understands, clearly, that you will be fine. You will be fine. The body just hasn't gotten that memo yet. Love, actual love, as distinct from attachment, has a different texture entirely. It's quieter. It doesn't grip. It doesn't require constant maintenance or reassurance or the ongoing management of anxiety about whether it's still intact. Real love has a kind of spaciousness to it. Room for two people to be themselves, including the inconvenient parts. Room for disagreement that doesn't feel like dissolution. Room for distance that doesn't immediately read as abandonment. Most importantly, love includes choice. You are with this person because you have assessed, clearly and without the distorting pressure of fear, that being with them is what you actually want. Not because leaving is unthinkable, because staying is chosen. A woman I observed for a long time, a friend, someone I watched cycle through the same relationship 3 times over 4 years, described her reason for going back each time as feeling like she couldn't breathe without him. She said it like it was proof of love. I remember thinking that not being able to breathe is actually a medical problem, not a romantic one. The distinction matters because it changes what you do next. If what you have is love, it can withstand examination. It can withstand honest conversation, temporary distance, disagreement, the ordinary friction of 2 people with different needs occupying the same space. Love, when it's real, doesn't require you to manage it constantly. It doesn't require you to be careful all the time, editing yourself to prevent the relationship from destabilizing. It's more durable than that. If what you have is attachment, Examination feels dangerous. Distance feels like loss. Disagreement feels like a crack in something that could shatter. You spend significant energy keeping things smooth because smooth feels like safe, and safe is what the attachment is fundamentally about. Here is the most precise way to identify which one you're in. Ask yourself, if I knew with certainty that this person would be completely okay, happy even and without me, would I still want to be with them? Not out of habit. Not out of fear of starting over. Not because leaving feels complicated. Would I actively choose them? If the answer is yes, that's information. If the answer produces a long pause followed by a change of subject, that's also information. Attachment asks, will I survive if they leave? Love asks, do I want to be here? These questions point in completely different directions. The first is about your nervous system managing a threat. The second is about your actual preferences in the absence of fear. Most people have spent so long in the first question that they've lost contact with the second entirely. They don't know what they want. They only know what they're afraid of losing. Getting back to choice requires, first, reducing the fear enough that the choice can be made clearly. This means tolerating distance without treating it as disaster. It means sitting with uncertainty without rushing to resolve it. It means developing enough internal stability that the question, do I want this? Can be asked honestly without the answer being contaminated by, but what if they leave? This is slow work. It is also the only work that actually changes anything. Because here is what happens when people skip it. They leave one attachment and immediately form another, equally anxious one with someone new. Or they stay in the current one and continue the same loop, telling themselves things will change when they won't, because nothing has changed in the mechanism producing the loop. The relationship is not the problem. The unexamined attachment pattern is the problem. And it travels. Choice, by contrast, is portable in the right way. When you develop the capacity to actually choose, to stay from preference rather than fear, to leave from clarity rather than pain, that capacity comes with you. Into the next relationship, into the one after that. You stop arriving at connections as someone who needs them to work. You start arriving as someone who is assessing whether they want them to. The difference in how people respond to you is immediate and slightly startling, because there is something unmistakable about a person who is genuinely choosing you. It doesn't perform. It doesn't cling. It doesn't require constant reassurance that the choice is being reciprocated. It simply lands, with a weight and a steadiness that anxious attachment, for all its intensity, never quite manages. That steadiness is what love actually feels like. Not the gripping, not the breathlessness, not the particular torture of waiting to find out if you're still wanted, just the quiet, chosen decision to be here. You're allowed to want that. You're also allowed to notice that you haven't had it yet, and that this might be worth understanding before you proceed. Chapter 5. The art of disappearing slowly. Nobody decides to erase themselves. That would require a level of conscious intention that the process specifically avoids. What actually happens is smaller. A comment you don't make because the timing feels wrong. A need you don't mention because mentioning it last time produced a silence that lasted 3 days and wasn't worth it. An opinion you soften, not because you don't hold it, but because holding it at full volume seems, in the context of this particular relationship, more trouble than it's worth. Each of these moments is minor, reasonable even. Taken individually, they are just social adaptation. the ordinary compromise of being a person among other people. Taken together, over months, over years, they are the slow erasure of a self. This is what self-abandonment actually looks like. Not a dramatic sacrifice, not a single catastrophic moment of surrender. Just a long series of small edits, each one defensible, accumulating into something that is no longer quite you. The cruelest part is that the process is invisible while it's happening. You don't feel yourself disappearing. You feel yourself managing, adapting, being mature, choosing your battles. The language of self-abandonment is almost entirely borrowed from the language of emotional intelligence, which makes it almost impossible to criticize in real time. How do you argue with, "I'm just trying to keep the peace"? How do you challenge, "I'm being the bigger person here"? You can't, from the outside. And from the inside, it doesn't feel like loss. It feels like effort, like care, like the kind of love that requires something of you. By the time it feels like loss, the editing has been running long enough that you've partially forgotten what the original file looked like. Here is the specific sequence. Because sequences are useful, it starts with a calculation. Usually unconscious, always fast. You have a feeling, a need, a limit, a truth, and your nervous system runs a quick cost-benefit on expressing it. What happens if I say this? How will they react? Is this worth the disruption? Most of the time, for people with the pattern we've been describing, the calculation comes back. Not worth it. So you don't say it. You file it somewhere internal and move forward with the conversation, slightly less present than you were before. That filing system fills up faster than you'd expect. The second phase is rationalization. Once you've suppressed something often enough, you need a story for why. The story is usually generous to the other person and costs you. They're going through a lot right now. This isn't the right moment. It's not that big a deal. I'm probably being too sensitive. These stories are not always wrong. Sometimes the timing really is bad. Sometimes the thing really isn't a big deal. But when the story is always the same story, always in the same direction, always arriving to justify the same silence, it has stopped being an assessment and become a habit. The third phase is the one that does the most damage. You stop noticing. The feelings still arrive. The needs are still there. But you've become so practiced at the initial suppression that the gap between feeling something and filing it away shrinks to nearly nothing. You don't experience the internal debate anymore. You just don't say things automatically, smoothly, without the friction that used to at least tell you something was happening. This is the phase where people describe feeling numb or disconnected or like something is wrong, but they can't identify what. They're still functional, still pleasant, still, by most external measures, fine. But they've lost contact with their own interior, and that loss is disorienting in a way that's hard to articulate, because the thing that's missing is the instrument you'd normally use to identify what's missing. I had a conversation once with someone who told me she'd realized, somewhere in the third year of her marriage, that she didn't know what she actually thought about most things anymore. Not politically or philosophically, just day to day. What she wanted for dinner, whether she was happy, what she would do if she had a day entirely to herself. She'd spent so long calibrating to someone else's preferences that her own had gone. Not away exactly, but quiet. Inaccessibly quiet. She said she'd spent 6 months after that conversation trying to figure out what she actually liked. Not performing liking things, actually liking them. She described it as one of the stranger experiences of her adult life. That's self-abandonment in its advanced form. Not dramatic, not immediately legible as loss. Just a slow accumulation of small surrenders until the person doing the surrendering isn't sure what they were defending in the first place. Here is what makes it particularly adhesive. The people around you often prefer the edited version. Not consciously, not cruelly, but the version of you that doesn't make demands, doesn't voice discomfort, doesn't take up complicated space is simply easier to be around. It generates less friction, less adjustment. The relationship runs more smoothly when one person is running the constant background process of making it smooth, so the dynamic reinforces itself. You disappear a little, things go better. You disappear a little more. The relationship continues. Somewhere in your nervous system, a connection forms. Less of me equals more stability. And stability, for someone who grew up in an unpredictable environment, is extraordinarily compelling. Even when the stability is false. Even when it's the stability of a room where nobody says anything real. Coming back from this is not a single decision. It is a series of small reversals, mirrors of the small suppressions that caused the disappearance in the first place. You say the thing you would normally file away. You let the discomfort of having said it exist without rushing to manage it. You tolerate the possibility that saying true things might cost you something, and you say them anyway. Each small reversal is a retrieval, a piece of the original file restored. This will feel, at first, disproportionately difficult. You are not just saying a true thing. You are overriding a deeply practiced pattern, one that has the backing of years of reinforcement and the entire weight of a nervous system that learned, correctly for its original context, that visibility was risky. That context is gone. The pattern remains. The reversals have to be small enough to be survivable and frequent enough to accumulate. You don't undo years of editing in a single honest conversation. You undo it across hundreds of moments, small, ordinary, unglamorous moments where you choose presence over management, and slowly, something returns. Not all at once, not linearly, but the interior voice that went quiet starts to become audible again. Your own preferences become legible to you. You begin to notice the gap between what you actually feel and what you're performing, which means the gap has shrunk enough to be visible. Disappearing slowly means reappearing slowly too. That's the honest version of what the recovery looks like. It is not, it should be said, particularly cinematic, but you were never actually gone. You were just very quiet. Chapter 6. Sitting with silence without losing your mind. The average person, left alone with no phone and no task and no noise, lasts approximately 4 minutes before doing something to end the situation. This has been studied. Researchers put people in a room with nothing to do and gave them the option to administer mild electric shocks to themselves as an alternative to sitting quietly. A significant percentage chose the shocks. One man shocked himself 190 times in 15 minutes. The researchers noted this with what one imagines was a mixture of scientific interest and personal concern. The study was not about pain tolerance. It was about how aggressively humans will avoid being alone with their own minds. The shock wasn't appealing. It was just preferable to the silence. Most people read that finding and think, that's extreme. Then they check their phone for the 4th time in an hour for no specific reason. Then they text someone they don't particularly want to talk to because the alternative is sitting with a quiet that has started to feel, for reasons they can't quite name, accusatory. This is not a character flaw. It is the predictable result of spending years using other people as emotional infrastructure. When someone else's attention has been functioning as your primary source of internal regulation, your nervous system's preferred method of confirming that you are okay, solitude stops being neutral. It becomes a gap where the regulation used to be. And gaps, to a nervous system built on vigilance, feel like emergencies. Loneliness is not the problem. The problem is what loneliness means to you. For most people with the pattern this book has been describing, being alone doesn't just feel unpleasant. It feels like evidence of something wrong with the situation, with the relationship, with themselves. The silence becomes a verdict. Nobody is here because nobody wants to be here. Nobody wants to be here because of something true about me. That chain of reasoning happens fast. Faster than reasoning, really. It's a felt conclusion, arriving before thought, and it produces the specific panic that sends people reaching for their phone, their ex, their least favorite person who is at least a person. Anything to interrupt the silence before it finishes saying what they're afraid it's saying. What the silence is actually saying, most of the time, is nothing. It's just quiet. But learning to experience it as nothing, as neutral space rather than threatening absence, requires a kind of exposure that most people have been carefully avoiding since they were old enough to find distractions. Here is what happens when you stop avoiding it. The first few minutes are genuinely uncomfortable. The mind moves immediately toward the things it hasn't resolved. The conversation that went wrong. The relationship that's uncertain. The future that isn't secured. This is not the silence being cruel. This is the mind doing what minds do when they're not occupied. Processing. Sorting. Surfacing the things that were filed under. Deal with this later during the busy hours. Most people interpret this surfacing as evidence that silence is bad for them. The opposite is true. The discomfort is the process working. The fact that it feels bad is not an argument for stopping. It's an argument for continuing. If you stay, if you don't reach for the phone, don't turn on the noise, don't manufacture a reason to engage with something external, something shifts. It usually takes longer than feels reasonable. 10 minutes, sometimes 20. But the intensity of the initial discomfort peaks and then, without drama, begins to subside. What remains is not emptiness. It's more like presence. Your own presence, which turns out to be something you haven't been in contact with in a while. I remember the first time I sat with silence long enough to get through the uncomfortable part. I was expecting nothing in particular and found, on the other side of the discomfort, that I had several fairly clear opinions about my own life that I had apparently been too busy to notice. Not revelations, just information, the kind that's available in quiet and completely inaccessible in noise. It was, in a modest way, startling. This is what solitude is actually for, not punishment. Not the consolation prize for people who can't maintain relationships. A specific cognitive and emotional environment that cannot be replicated in the presence of other people, no matter how comfortable those people are. Certain kinds of self-knowledge only become available when you are alone, quiet, and not managing anyone else's experience of you. People who are afraid of solitude are, in a precise sense, afraid of self-knowledge. Not because they're cowardly, because their self-knowledge has historically arrived with a side of shame or loneliness, or the particular ache of unmet need. So they've learned to keep the volume high, stay busy, stay connected, stay distracted, anything to prevent the quiet from delivering its assessment. The work is learning to separate solitude from its emotional associations. Solitude is not abandonment. It is not rejection. It is not the universe confirming your worst suspicion about yourself. It is just time, alone, which is a neutral condition that you are bringing a significant amount of meaning to. Practical note: because this is where the abstract becomes useful, the exposure has to be deliberate. You do not accidentally develop comfort with solitude. You build it the way you build any tolerance, incrementally, repeatedly, without immediately escaping when it gets uncomfortable. Sit for 10 minutes without your phone. Not meditating, not journaling, not doing anything productive. Just sitting. Let whatever surfaces surface. Notice the urge to reach for something and don't reach. This is the whole practice. It is not sophisticated. It is also not easy, because the urge is strong and the discomfort is real, and nothing about the first several attempts will feel like progress. It is progress. It just doesn't feel like it yet. What you are building underneath the discomfort is evidence. Evidence for your nervous system that silence is survivable, that you do not dissolve when no one is paying attention to you, that your sense of self does not require constant external input to remain intact. This evidence accumulates slowly, and then, at some point that's hard to identify precisely, tips into something that functions like confidence. Not the loud kind, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself, the kind that simply doesn't panic when the phone is quiet. When you stop being afraid of silence, something changes in how you relate to people. You are no longer using them to manage your interior state. You are no longer reaching for connection as a form of regulation. You are choosing to be with people because you want to be, not because the alternative has become intolerable. That shift is perceptible to other people in a way that's difficult to articulate, but unmistakable to experience. There is a quality of presence in someone who is not using you to feel okay. It's relaxed in a way that anxious connection never is. It doesn't grip. It doesn't require. It simply is there. Choosing to be there. That quality, more than attractiveness or wit or any other variable people tend to focus on, is what makes someone genuinely compelling to be around. And it comes entirely from having learned to be alone without treating it like a problem. The man in the study who shocked himself 190 times was not unusual. He was just honest about what most people are doing more quietly. We are all, in various ways, choosing the shock over the silence. The question is whether you're ready to put the button down. Chapter 7. The discipline nobody teaches. Nobody sits a child down and explains that feelings are information, not instructions. This is a significant oversight, given how much of adult life is spent dealing with the consequences of having missed that distinction. Instead, most people receive one of two educations about emotion, both of them incomplete. The first, feelings are important and should be expressed, which gets interpreted as whatever I feel, I should immediately do something about. The second, feelings are disruptive and should be managed, which gets interpreted as whatever I feel, I should immediately make stop. Neither of these is emotional intelligence. The first is reactivity. The second is suppression. And the space between them, the actual discipline, the part that changes lives, gets almost no attention. That space is where this chapter lives. Emotional independence is a phrase that gets misunderstood almost every time it's used. People hear it and picture someone who doesn't feel much, someone contained to the point of coldness, self-sufficient to the point of isolation. The person at the party who seems fine and is possibly a little unnerving, that's not it. Emotional independence is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of choice. It means you feel everything. The anxiety, the anger, the longing, the sudden irrational devastation triggered by something that shouldn't matter this much. And then you decide what to do next. Not what the feeling tells you to do next. What you, having registered the feeling and understood something about what it's pointing at, actually choose to do next. This gap between feeling and action is where freedom lives. It is also the thing that most people, most of the time, do not have. Their feelings arrive, and their behaviors follow automatically, the way a knee moves when you tap it in the right place. Not a choice. A reflex. Here is what reflex-driven emotional life looks like in practice. A message arrives later than expected. The body responds before the mind. Tightening, a small spike of anxiety, the rapid assessment of what the lateness means. The mind then constructs a narrative to match the feeling. They're pulling away. Something is wrong. I should say something. I should not say something. Why haven't they? By the time actual thinking is available, a behavior has often already been initiated. The double text sent. The casual-sounding message that took 45 minutes to compose. The conversation started not because you had something to say, but because the silence was producing feelings you needed to interrupt. This is not stupidity. This is an untrained nervous system doing exactly what untrained nervous systems do. Training looks like this. The message arrives late. The body responds. You notice the response. There it is, the tightening, the anxiety spike, without immediately treating it as a directive. You create a pause, not a long one, not a performance of calm you don't feel. Just enough space to ask, what is actually happening here? And what do I actually want to do about it? Often the answer to what is actually happening here is, not much. A person sent a message later than usual. That's the complete list of confirmed facts. Everything else, the narrative about what it means, the story about pulling away, the catalog of similar incidents from the past 3 months, is interpretation. Running on old data, filtered through a nervous system that learned long ago that delays in response were often significant. Sometimes they were. In that original environment, they probably were. Here, now, with this person, they might just mean the person was busy. The pause creates the possibility of responding to what's actually happening rather than to the story about what's happening. This sounds minor. It is not minor. It is the difference between a life where your emotional responses are calibrated to current reality and a life where they're calibrated to a reality that stopped existing decades ago. Developing this pause is not comfortable in the early stages. The emotional charge wants to discharge. The body wants to move, to do something, to resolve the tension through action. Sitting with that charge without acting on it feels, initially, like a kind of internal pressure that has no outlet. This is why most people don't do it. Not because they've decided reactivity is better, because the alternative is genuinely uncomfortable, and nobody told them the discomfort was temporary, and the other side of it was worth reaching. The discomfort is temporary. The other side is worth reaching. What changes, with practice, is not the feelings. They continue to arrive. Anxiety still spikes when it spikes. Anger still arrives when it arrives. The amplitude doesn't necessarily decrease. What changes is your relationship to the feelings. They stop being emergencies that require immediate resolution and start being information. Data points, signals worth reading before acting on. Anger starts to show you where a boundary was crossed. Anxiety starts to show you where uncertainty exists that you haven't addressed honestly. Sadness starts to show you what you actually valued in something that's been lost. The feelings become useful rather than destabilizing because you've stopped treating them as instructions and started treating them as messages. My own version of this was learning, fairly late, that most of what I called anxiety about relationships was actually unexpressed honesty. Something I hadn't said. A limit I'd observed being crossed without naming it. A need I'd filed away on the grounds that mentioning it would be inconvenient. The anxiety wasn't random. It was the accumulating pressure of everything I'd decided not to say, looking for somewhere to go. When I started saying the things instead of storing them, the anxiety didn't disappear. But it stopped arriving without explanation. That's the practical value of emotional intelligence as discipline rather than performance. It makes your inner life legible to you. And when your inner life is legible, you stop being surprised by your own reactions. You stop doing things you later can't explain. You stop waking up at 3 a.m. with a nameless dread that refuses to be identified because you've been too busy managing everything else to notice what you actually feel. There is one specific application of this that matters most for the patterns this book is about. When someone's behavior triggers a strong emotional response in you, withdrawal, dismissal, inconsistency, any of the things that activate the old pattern, the trained response is to pause long enough to separate what's happening now from what it reminds you of, because the response you're having is almost never purely to the present moment. It's a composite. Current event plus old memory plus nervous system pattern plus everything this situation resembles from before. The present person is receiving a reaction calibrated partly to people who aren't in the room. That's not fair to them. More importantly, it's not useful to you. Because if you can't see the current person clearly, if they keep blurring into the composite, you cannot accurately assess whether they're someone worth choosing. Emotional discipline gives you the ability to see clearly, not without feeling, through the feeling, to what's actually there. This is what nobody teaches, not because it's a secret, because it requires practice in conditions of discomfort. And discomfort is something most educational environments are specifically designed to minimize. You have to learn it yourself in real moments, with real stakes, which is inconvenient. But it is also, genuinely, one of the few things that changes everything else. Feel everything. Obey nothing automatically. Decide what comes next. That's the whole discipline. Everything else is variation. Chapter 8. The Overgiving Trap. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from generosity that was never really generosity. It doesn't feel like other exhaustion. It has a specific texture, resentful, confused, faintly self-righteous. The internal monologue sounds something like, I do everything, I give everything, I show up constantly, and somehow it's never enough. This monologue is delivered with the genuine bewilderment of someone who has not yet understood that what they were doing was never actually about the other person. Overgiving looks like generosity. It presents as selflessness. It speaks the language of care. But underneath the presentation, if you're willing to look, is something considerably less flattering. The belief that you are not enough on your own, and that the gap between what you are and what is lovable must be filled with what you do. This is not a moral failing. It is a logical conclusion. drawn from available evidence, by a person who learned early that presence alone was insufficient and performance was what got rewarded. You are not generous because you have so much to give. You are generous because giving feels safer than simply being. Doing is controllable. Being is exposed. And exposure for people with this pattern has historically been risky, so you give. Preemptively, exhaustingly, in ways that leave no space for anyone else to contribute. Because if you need nothing and provide everything, the equation seems to work in your favor. You are valuable. You are needed. You cannot easily be replaced. This feels like security. It is actually a very elaborate, very tiring performance of security, and it requires constant maintenance because the moment you stop, the fear resurfaces. Without what I provide, am I still wanted? The honest answer to that question for the overgiver is, I don't know, and not knowing is intolerable. Here is what overgiving actually does to a relationship, functionally. When you give without limit, time, attention, understanding, second chances, the benefit of every doubt, you remove the necessity for the other person to bring anything. Not because they're lazy or calculating, though sometimes that's true, but because you've structured the dynamic so that your giving fills all available space. There's no gap left for their effort to occupy. You've made yourself indispensable in a way that, paradoxically, removes the conditions under which genuine connection could form. Genuine connection requires two people with actual needs, actually meeting each other. When one person has systematically hidden their needs and preemptively met everyone else's, what's left is not connection. It's a service arrangement. And service arrangements, however warm they feel at the start, do not produce the thing you were looking for when you started giving in the first place. They produce appreciation. Appreciation is not love. Appreciation is what you feel for a very good accountant. The resentment arrives on schedule, usually 6 to 18 months in, sometimes longer, always building from small moments into something that eventually has weight. You gave something, your time, your energy, something that cost you, and it was received without particular notice. This happens, and you absorb it. It happens again, you absorb it again. You have a whole internal system for absorption, developed over years, very efficient. But absorption has a limit. And when that limit is reached, the resentment doesn't arrive quietly. It arrives with a full accounting of every unacknowledged thing, presented to someone who had no idea the ledger was being kept. This is confusing for them. You never said you were keeping a ledger. You appeared to be giving freely. And here is the uncomfortable part. You were keeping a ledger. Unconsciously, involuntarily, but accurately. Every overgiver keeps a ledger. The ledger is just the list of all the things given in hope of return, disguised as generosity. The return never had to be equivalent. It just had to be visible. Some acknowledgement that you are seen, valued, chosen, not for what you provide, but for what you are. That acknowledgement almost never comes in the way you're hoping for, because you've structured the dynamic so thoroughly around providing that the other person has learned to relate to you as a provider. They're not withholding recognition of yourself. They've never been given the opportunity to see it. You've kept it carefully behind everything you do. I gave someone 3 years of showing up in every way I could construct and called it love. At the end of it, I was empty, and they were genuinely surprised that anything was wrong. Not because they were oblivious, because I had performed fine for 3 years with professional consistency. I had never once handed them the real version of what I needed. I had decided, without consulting them, that the real version was too much. They never got to disagree with that assessment. I made it for both of us. That's the thing about overgiving that doesn't get said enough. It is a form of control. Gentle, well-intentioned, self-destructive control. But control. You are managing the relationship by managing your own presentation within it, giving so consistently that the other person never has to make a real choice about whether they want to show up. The choice is removed, the dynamic is maintained, and you pay for the maintenance with your energy and your honesty and eventually your sense of self. Stopping is not as simple as giving less. The anxiety arrives quickly when you reduce the giving. Your nervous system interprets the reduction as risk. If I stop providing, I become optional, and produces all the feelings associated with threat. The urge to fill the gap is strong and immediate, and feels in the moment genuinely caring. I just want to help. I just want them to be okay. Yes, and also you want to be indispensable, and those two things are running simultaneously, and you have been calling only the first one by name. The practice is intentional restraint, not coldness, not withdrawal. Just pausing before you give to ask the question, is this coming from genuine desire or from fear of what happens if I don't? Fear-based giving has a particular feeling, slightly urgent, slightly obligatory. The sense that something will go wrong if you don't. Genuine giving feels different, lighter, more spacious, freely chosen. You want to give this. Not because you need the return, but because giving it is its own reward. When you start distinguishing between them, you will discover that a higher percentage of your giving falls into the first category than you would like. This is not a pleasant discovery. It is an accurate one. Giving less, intentionally, also reveals the relationship's actual structure. Some people, when you stop filling every space, step into the gap. They contribute. They check in. They meet you somewhere closer to the middle. This is information of the best kind. Other people don't notice, or they notice and resent the change, or they simply receive less and don't adjust their own output at all. That is also information. More uncomfortable, but equally valuable. What you're looking for is reciprocity, not equivalence. Relationships are not spreadsheets, and exact symmetry is neither possible nor interesting, but a basic sense that energy flows in both directions, that your presence generates investment, not just comfort, that you are valued, not merely useful. You cannot find this out while you are filling every available space with what you provide. The information is hidden underneath your own generosity. You have to create the space to see it, and then you have to tolerate what the space reveals, which will sometimes be uncomfortable and sometimes be clarifying and occasionally be both at once. Overgiving was never the proof of your worth. It was the symptom of having forgotten it. When you remember, when you return to the baseline understanding that you are enough simply as a person, without performance, without provision, without the elaborate architecture of usefulness you've constructed, giving becomes something different. Lighter, chosen, real. And what it produces, finally, is something that actually resembles what you were looking for all along. Chapter 9. Boundaries aren't walls, they're job descriptions. Most people who struggle with boundaries don't lack courage. They lack clarity. They have spent so long adapting to other people's needs, managing other people's comfort, calibrating their own presentation to the emotional temperature of each room they enter, that they have lost track of a fairly fundamental piece of information: what they actually are and are not available for. The boundary isn't missing because they're too afraid to set it. It's missing because they genuinely don't know where they end and where the accommodation begins. This is what years of self-editing does. It doesn't just change your behavior. It obscures your own map. A boundary is not a wall. This distinction matters because walls are defensive, static, built to keep things out. A boundary is more like a job description. It's a document that specifies what the role includes and what it doesn't. What you're available for, what falls outside your scope, what happens when someone asks you to do something that isn't in the description. Job descriptions are not hostile documents. They're clarifying ones. They exist not to create conflict, but to prevent the particular kind of resentment that builds when expectations are unspoken, assumptions are made, and everyone ends up confused about why things feel wrong. Most relationships have no job description. They operate on unspoken expectations accumulated over time, adjusted constantly in the background by one or both people, never actually named. This works reasonably well when both people's unspoken expectations roughly align. When they don't, the gap fills with resentment, confusion, and a specific kind of low-grade antagonism that nobody can quite explain because nobody ever named what they were actually expecting. Boundaries name it. That's the primary function. Not protection, not punishment, clarity. Here is what clarity does that vagueness cannot. Clarity allows the other person to actually choose. When you are genuinely clear about what you are and are not available for, the person in front of you has real information. They can decide, with that information, whether they want to engage on those terms. This is a significantly more honest dynamic than the one most people are operating in, where one person is secretly disappointed and the other has no idea why, and both are performing a version of okay that neither of them actually feels. Vagueness feels safer because it avoids the confrontation of naming things. But vagueness doesn't actually prevent conflict. It just delays it and adds interest. The conflict that emerges from years of unspoken expectations is considerably more damaging than the discomfort of a clear conversation early on. People who have never set a boundary consistently describe the anticipation as worse than the event. They spend weeks, sometimes months, rehearsing the conversation, imagining explosions, catastrophic reactions, the relationship dissolving in real time. Then they have the conversation, and the other person says something like, "Okay, that's fair," and the weeks of anticipation turn out to have been, as anticipatory suffering usually is, a significantly more dramatic version of events than the events themselves. Not always. Sometimes the reaction is difficult. Sometimes the other person pushes back, argues, tries to negotiate the boundary into something more convenient for them. This is also information. The reaction to a clearly stated limit tells you more about a person than almost anything else. Someone who responds to your boundary with curiosity and respect is a different proposition entirely from someone who responds with manipulation, guilt, or a sustained campaign to make you feel unreasonable for having one. The second person is demonstrating, directly and helpfully, that they were attached to your limitlessness, not to you, to the version of you that had no edges. That version was never the real version. It was the performance. And any relationship built on the performance has been built on something that cannot be sustained. Here is the specific error most people make when they finally attempt to set a boundary. They over-explain. They don't say, "I'm not available for that." They say, "I'm not available for that." And I want you to understand why. Because I've been thinking about it a lot. And it's not about you specifically. It's more about where I am right now and what I need in terms of my own space, which isn't something I've always been good at identifying, but I've been working on it, and I really value what we have here. So I want to be honest about this, even though it's a little uncomfortable to say. By the end of that sentence, the boundary has been so thoroughly apologized for that it barely exists. The over-explanation is not honesty. It's the old pattern in new clothing, managing the other person's reaction, softening the thing until it's palatable, ensuring they don't feel bad about receiving information that is, fundamentally, just information. A boundary does not require justification. It requires only statement. This doesn't work for me. I'm not available for that. I need this to be different. These are complete sentences. They don't need supporting documentation. The discomfort you feel when delivering them without extensive footnotes is not a signal that you've done something wrong. It's the feeling of doing something unfamiliar in a body that has been trained to always soften, always explain, always ensure the other person's comfort before your own truth. The body will adapt. It takes repetition. There is a particular form of boundary that people find especially difficult to set, and it's worth naming specifically. It's the retroactive boundary, the limit placed on something that has been tolerated for a long time. This is harder than setting a boundary at the start of a dynamic because the other person has, reasonably from their perspective, assumed that the absence of previous objection constituted consent. They didn't know a line was being crossed because you didn't tell them, and now you are telling them, and they are confused and possibly defensive about a pattern of behavior they were not aware was problematic. This is uncomfortable. It is also necessary. The conversation sounds something like, "I've realized that thing doesn't work for me, and I haven't said anything before, but I'm saying it now." You don't need to account for why you didn't say it before. You don't need to apologize for having tolerated it. You just need to name the current reality, which is that you are no longer available for it. What happens next is, again, information. I learned to set retroactive boundaries considerably later than would have been useful. There was a friendship, long-standing, genuinely valued, where a particular pattern had been running for years. The pattern involved my availability being treated as essentially unconditional. Calls at any hour. Emotional crises that required immediate response. The implicit understanding that my own state was secondary to the current emergency. I had enabled this pattern enthusiastically for years because being needed felt, for reasons we've now thoroughly covered, like a form of safety. When I finally named it, the response was not gratitude. It was a period of significant hostility, followed by a renegotiation of the friendship into something more mutual. The hostility was uncomfortable. The renegotiation was worth it. The friendship that exists now is one I actually want to be in, rather than one I feel obscurely obligated to maintain. That distinction, wanting to be in something versus feeling obligated to maintain it, is what boundaries make possible. Without them, relationships default to obligation. The shape of the dynamic is determined not by what both people actually want, but by what both people assume is required to keep the thing intact. You stay because leaving seems wrong. You give because stopping seems selfish. You tolerate because objecting seems like too much. And somewhere underneath all that quiet obligation is a relationship that neither person has actually chosen, running on inertia and mutual avoidance of the conversation that might change it. Boundaries interrupt inertia. That's the other thing they do, beyond clarity. they force a real assessment. When you name what you are and are not available for, both people have to decide whether they want to be in the arrangement that actually exists, rather than the one that's been assumed. Some arrangements survive this assessment easily. Others reveal themselves to have been built almost entirely on the absence of honesty. The ones that survive are the ones worth having. And here is the thing about people who have clear, calmly stated, consistently held limits. They are, uniformly, more compelling to be around. Not because playing hard to get works, which is a different and considerably less interesting game, but because clarity is rare, and rare things have weight. When you say yes, it means something, because your no is real. When you're present, it lands differently, because your absence is possible. When you engage, it feels like a choice, because it is one. That's what boundaries produce. Not distance, not coldness, not the slow accumulation of walls between you and the people you care about. Just the simple, clarifying, relationship-changing fact of knowing where you stand, which turns out to be the thing most people have been looking for in every relationship they've ever been in, and almost never thought to provide for themselves first. Chapter 10. Guilt is the entrance fee for leaving the old self behind. Guilt arrives precisely on schedule. Not before you change. Not after you've settled into the new pattern and can assess it calmly. Guilt arrives in the exact moment of the change itself, when you say the no, when you leave the conversation early, when you choose your own need over someone else's comfort for the first time in recent memory. It arrives with the speed and conviction of a system that has been waiting for exactly this moment to intervene. This timing is not accidental. It is the mechanism. Guilt is the emotional immune response of a self that has organized itself around a particular set of rules. When the rules change, the immune response fires. It is trying to restore the previous state. Not because the previous state was good for you, but because the previous state was stable, known, and had stopped producing the kind of friction that change produces. The body prefers a familiar discomfort to an unfamiliar one. Guilt is the body voting for what it knows. Understanding this does not make guilt disappear. It makes guilt interpretable. And interpretable is significantly more useful than overwhelming. Here is the specific reframe that changes everything. Guilt, in this context, is not a signal that you have done something wrong. It is a signal that you have done something new. These feel identical from the inside. The same tightening, the same urge to undo, the same mental replay of the moment looking for what could be corrected. But they point in completely different directions. One is telling you to stop. The other is telling you that you're moving. The only way to tell them apart is to ask a single question. Did I harm someone? Or did I simply fail to prioritize them? Harming someone is a moral category. It involves action that damages, deception, cruelty, genuine neglect of someone in your care. Failing to prioritize someone is a different category entirely. It means you chose yourself instead of them. You rested when they wanted your attention. You said no when they wanted yes. You held a limit when they wanted flexibility. These things may disappoint the other person. They do not harm them. The disappointment is real. The harm is not. Guilt conflates these categories deliberately. This is what makes it so effective as a mechanism of behavioral control. If guilt can convince you that disappointment equals damage, that someone feeling let down by you is morally equivalent to you having done something wrong, then every assertion of your own needs becomes a transgression that requires correction. and correction always looks the same. Undo the change, return to the previous state, restore the other person's comfort at the expense of your own. This is why people who have spent years people-pleasing feel genuine moral distress when they stop. Not performed distress. Real distress, produced by a nervous system that has learned, with great thoroughness, that other people's discomfort is your responsibility and your failure. It isn't. It never was. But the learning runs deep, and deep learning does not update through argument. It updates through experience, repeated, accumulated experience of setting the limit, feeling the guilt, surviving the guilt, and observing that nothing catastrophic occurred. The guilt fades. Not immediately, not linearly, but it fades. And what replaces it, incrementally, is something that doesn't announce itself loudly, but changes the texture of your daily experience in a way that compounds over time. Self-respect. The quiet, structural kind. The kind that isn't confidence exactly. It doesn't perform, doesn't require validation, doesn't need to be maintained through constant assertion. It's more like a foundation than a feeling. Something underneath the ordinary movement of your days that you stop noticing only because it's always there. The particular shape guilt takes matters, because guilt is not one thing. It arrives in several distinct forms, and each one has a slightly different mechanism worth understanding. The first is anticipatory guilt. This is the guilt that arrives before the change. The guilt you feel just contemplating saying no, just imagining the conversation where you name the limit. This form is the most effectively controlling because it operates before any action has been taken. It argues that the discomfort you imagine the other person feeling is sufficient reason not to proceed. This is guilt functioning as a prediction, and the prediction is almost always wrong. The reaction you imagine is typically more extreme than the one that occurs, because imagined reactions are populated by every previous experience of disappointing someone, compressed into a single anticipated catastrophe. Real people, in real moments, generally react with more variability and less drama than the version of them you've been rehearsing in your head for 3 weeks. The second is reactive guilt. The guilt that arrives immediately after the change, when the other person's actual response is visible. This is the most acutely uncomfortable form because it has something concrete to attach to. They seem hurt. They've gone quiet. They said something that suggests they're disappointed, and the guilt seizes on these signals as confirmation. You caused this. You should fix it. The critical skill here is pausing long enough to distinguish between "they are hurt" and "I did something wrong." People experience hurt when their expectations are not met. Expectations can be unreasonable. They can be based on a version of you that no longer exists. They can be the product of a dynamic you have been sustaining at your own expense and have now, reasonably and rightly, stopped sustaining. Their hurt is real. Your responsibility for it is not automatic. The third form is retrospective guilt. The guilt that arrives later, sometimes much later, reviewing past changes and finding them insufficient or excessive. I went too far. I wasn't kind enough about it. I should have done it differently. This form is the most insidious because it operates on events that are already complete and cannot be revised, which means it produces suffering without any possibility of the corrective action it's nominally pointing toward. It is guilt as pure self-punishment, untethered from usefulness. When retrospective guilt arrives, the only honest response is, "The decision was made with the understanding I had at the time. I understand more now. This information is available for future decisions." Then you close the file. This sounds easier than it is. It requires practice. But the alternative, keeping the file open indefinitely, revisiting it for evidence of your own wrongdoing, serves nobody, least of all you. There is one more thing about guilt that needs to be said plainly. Some people in your life will use it deliberately, not always consciously, not always maliciously, but deliberately. When you change, when you stop being endlessly available, when you name a limit, when you start occupying the space that your growth requires, some people will respond in ways specifically calibrated to produce guilt. The wounded silence. The comment designed to remind you of what you owe. The subtle implication that the person you are becoming is somehow less than the person you were. These responses are not evidence that you've done something wrong. They are evidence that someone benefited from the previous arrangement and is experiencing the loss of that benefit. This distinction is important. People losing something they relied on are not the same as people being harmed. The feeling is real. The moral weight is not equivalent. You are allowed to see this clearly. You are allowed to have compassion for someone's disappointment while declining to be controlled by it. Both things at once. Compassion is not compliance. Empathy is not obligation. You can fully understand why someone is upset about your change and still not change back. This is, for most people with this pattern, one of the harder things to learn. Because empathy has been functioning for a long time as a trap, a mechanism by which you feel someone else's discomfort so acutely that your own needs become secondary by default. Empathy trained toward self-erasure is not a virtue. It is a vulnerability. Real empathy, mature empathy, includes yourself in its scope. It sees the other person's experience and also sees your own, and holds both without immediately sacrificing one for the other. When guilt arrives, as it will, note it. Name it internally. There's the guilt. Don't argue with it. Don't perform your way around it. Don't rush to resolve it through some corrective action that undoes the change you just made. Just let it be present while you proceed anyway. This is the entrance fee. Not a small one. Not paid once. But what's on the other side of it is not available any other way. A self you actually recognize. A life shaped by your own choices rather than other people's comfort. Relationships that exist because both people want them to, not because one person has made themselves too useful to leave. Guilt said you couldn't have this without paying a price. It was right about that part. It was wrong about whether the price was worth it. Chapter 11. The day you stop. It doesn't happen the way you think it will. There is no moment of cinematic clarity. No sunrise you watch from a window while something resolves inside you. No conversation that ends with both people understanding everything. No dramatic declaration, no clean break, no version of events that would make a satisfying final scene. The people who write about transformation as a single moment are either misremembering or selling something. What actually happens is smaller, quieter, and considerably more durable. You notice one ordinary day that you haven't checked your phone in 2 hours, not as a discipline, not because you decided to do that, just because something else was more interesting. This is minor. It is also for someone who has spent years using external response as a primary source of internal regulation, not minor at all. Or you're in a conversation where previously you would have managed yourself, edited, softened, calibrated, and you say the true thing instead. Not bravely, not with the conscious intention of being more authentic, just because the true thing arrived and you didn't intercept it. And the conversation continues. Nobody dissolves. you are still in the room. Or someone who would once have sent you into a spiral of interpretation. A short reply, a shifted tone, a silence lasting slightly longer than comfortable, produces in you something closer to a shrug. Not performance. Actual indifference to data that previously felt urgent. You notice this and think, huh. Then you move on. These moments don't feel like transformation. They feel like nothing, which is precisely the point. The anxiety that used to occupy that space is simply not there. And the absence of something you've lived with so long that you'd stopped noticing it is strange in a way that takes some getting used to. This is what stopping actually looks like. Not a decision, an accumulation. Hundreds of small moments, the pauses held, the reaching resisted, the true things said, the silences survived, that compound into a different baseline. You don't cross a line. You drift gradually into a different country. And one day you look up and notice the landscape has changed. There are specific things that change when you stop begging, and they are worth naming because they are not always what people expect. The first is what happens to your attention. When you are not running the constant background process of monitoring someone else's response to you, scanning for signals, interpreting silences, managing impressions, an extraordinary amount of cognitive space becomes available. You didn't know how much was being used until it stops being used. People describe this as suddenly being able to think more clearly, to focus more easily, to feel more present in their own life. This is not metaphor. It is the literal result of a significant processing load being lifted. That processing load was never free. You were paying for it with concentration, with creativity, with the low-grade exhaustion that made rest feel insufficient no matter how much of it you got. When the load lifts, the energy returns, often gradually, sometimes in a rush that's almost disorienting. Why do I suddenly have opinions about things I haven't thought about in years? Because you have the capacity for them again. The second change is what happens to your body, the nervous system that has been running in low-grade threat response, alert, vigilant, monitoring, begins slowly to regulate downward. The shoulder tension that you'd categorized as just how your shoulders are starts to ease. The chest tightness you'd attributed to a dozen other causes becomes less frequent. Sleep changes. Not always immediately, but the quality of rest shifts when the body stops needing to maintain readiness through the night. This sounds like a health claim, and it is one. The research on chronic stress and its physiological consequences is extensive and not encouraging. A body that has spent years in relational vigilance carries that vigilance physically, and a body that is learning to release it registers the change in ways that have nothing to do with emotion. The third change is what happens to your judgment, when you are no longer filtering every decision through the question of what it will mean for the relationship, whether it will be approved of, whether it will generate the response you need, whether it will risk the connection you're afraid of losing. Your decision-making becomes noticeably cleaner. You start making choices that are actually yours. Preferences you'd lost track of become legible again. You discover, sometimes with surprise, that you have opinions about your own life that you hadn't been consulting. This is the version of yourself that was always there, underneath the managing. It did not disappear during the years of accommodation. It just went quiet, waiting for conditions that felt safe enough to surface. The conditions are safer now, not because the world changed, because you did. The fourth change is the most significant and the most difficult to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. Your presence changes, not your appearance, not your behavior in any dramatic way. Not anything that would show up obviously in a before and after comparison. Something subtler and more fundamental. The quality of your attention in a room shifts when you are not using the room for regulation. You are actually there, curious, relatively unguarded, interested in what's happening, rather than in how you're being perceived while it's happening. People feel this, not consciously, usually, but they respond to it. The person who is genuinely present, who is there because they want to be and not because they need something from the encounter, produces a different relational dynamic than the person who is present anxiously, monitoring, performing. The first feels like company. The second, however pleasant they are to be around, feels like a kind of pressure. Not intentional, not obvious, but there. When your presence stops carrying that pressure, people relate to you differently, more easily, with less of the subtle wariness that anxious connection produces in others, even when they can't name why. You become, without trying, more comfortable to be around. This is the paradox that runs through everything this book has been saying. The attempt to be chosen, through performance, through overgiving, through the constant management of other people's perception of you, produces the opposite of what it's after. It signals need, and need in excess produces distance. Not always, not in everyone, but reliably enough to be a pattern worth recognizing. Stopping the attempt, becoming genuinely okay with or without a particular response, genuinely present rather than performing presence, produces connection that the attempt could never manufacture. Not because you've learned a better strategy, because you've stopped strategizing and become instead actually available. There is one more thing to say about the day you stop, and it's this. Some relationships will not survive it. This is not a side effect. It is a feature. The relationships that required your constant managing, your endless accommodation, your willingness to be less than you are so that someone else could be comfortable. Those relationships were built on a version of you that is no longer available. When that version retires, the relationships built on it have to renegotiate or dissolve. Some will renegotiate. People who actually want to be with you, the real version, the present one, the one that has needs and limits and the occasional inconvenient truth, will adjust. The dynamic will shift. Something more honest will emerge from what was there before. These renegotiations are sometimes uncomfortable and almost always worth it. Others will dissolve. The person who needed your self-erasure to stay close will not stay close to a version of you that has stopped erasing itself. They will find this new version difficult, demanding, changed in ways they didn't ask for. They will sometimes say so. They will sometimes simply fade. Either way, the loss is real. Loss is always real, even when it's the right outcome. What remains after the dissolution is not emptiness. It is the strange, clarifying experience of a life that is actually yours. The relationships in it are ones you've chosen and that have chosen you. The real you, not the managed version. The space you occupy is no longer borrowed from your own discomfort. The energy you have is no longer being consumed by the maintenance of a performance. You are, for possibly the first time in a long time, simply here, not chasing, not performing, not negotiating your right to take up space. Just here, in the ordinary and sufficient fact of your own presence. This is what was on the other side of all of it. Not a dramatic arrival, not a version of yourself that no longer feels things or needs things or has hard days. Just a self that knows, in the body rather than just the mind, that it does not need to beg for anything from anyone. That knowledge, once it lands in the right place, does not leave. Everything else proceeds from there. Chapter 12. The Mirror Problem. Most people spend their lives looking for someone to tell them who they are. This sounds dramatic. It is also almost universally true. Not in the obvious way. Few people would admit directly that they require external confirmation of their own identity. But watch the behavior. Watch what happens when approval is withdrawn. When someone goes cold or distant or simply stops paying attention. Watch the internal scramble that follows. The reinterpretation, the self-examination, the sudden and urgent need to understand, what did I do? What do I mean? Who am I to this person? And does that tell me something true about who I am in general? That scramble is the mirror problem. The mirror problem is this: when you do not have a stable, internally generated sense of who you are, you outsource the job to other people. Their perception of you becomes the primary data source for your self-concept. When their perception is warm and positive, you feel solid. When it shifts, when they're distracted, disappointed, or simply having a bad day that has nothing to do with you, you feel uncertain in a way that is wildly disproportionate to the actual event. A stranger is rude to you in a parking lot, and it ruins your afternoon. Not because the stranger's opinion matters, because your nervous system has been running on reflected perception for so long that any reflection from any source lands with more weight than it should. This is the advanced form of everything the previous chapters have been building toward. The begging, the overgiving, the attachment confusion, the guilt, they are all downstream of this single foundational problem. You do not know with enough certainty to withstand challenge who you are. So you keep checking. Every relationship, every interaction, every response and non-response becomes a referendum on the question you've never fully answered for yourself. The checking is exhausting. It also doesn't work. Not because people give you bad information. Sometimes they give you very good information, warm and specific and genuinely affirming. But even the good information doesn't satisfy for long, because the problem was never a lack of information. The problem is the outsourcing itself. You cannot solve an internal deficit with external data. The data helps for a moment, and then the deficit reasserts itself, and you need more data, and the cycle continues with the particular efficiency of all cycles built on the wrong solution to the right problem. Here is what a stable internal sense of self actually is, because it gets described in vague terms that don't help much. It is not confidence. Confidence is situational. You can be confident in one domain and completely uncertain in another, and this tells you almost nothing about whether you have a stable self-concept. It is not the absence of self-doubt. People with very clear identities doubt themselves regularly. It is not knowing exactly who you are in some final, permanent sense, because people change, and a rigid self-concept that can't accommodate change is its own problem. A stable internal sense of self is the capacity to remain recognizably yourself under pressure. When someone disapproves of you, challenges you, withdraws from you, you feel the impact. You're not numb, you're not performing indifference, but you don't restructure your entire self-concept around their reaction. You absorb the information, assess it for accuracy, take what's useful, and discard what isn't. And you remain, throughout, fundamentally the same person you were before the input arrived. This capacity is what people who never developed the begging pattern take completely for granted. They are baffled by how destabilizing others' opinions can be for some people, because for them, an opinion is just an opinion. It has weight proportional to its source and relevance. It doesn't constitute a verdict. For people who grew up using others as mirrors, an opinion is never just an opinion. It is always potentially the true thing, the accurate reflection that tells you what you've always suspected about yourself but couldn't confirm. This is why criticism from someone who barely knows you can land with the same weight as criticism from someone who knows you deeply. The mirror problem doesn't discriminate by source quality. It just reflects. Developing an internal identity, a self that knows itself well enough to stop outsourcing the question, is not a quick process, and it is not primarily a cognitive one. You cannot think your way into a stable self-concept. You can understand the mechanism perfectly, describe it with precision, and still find yourself scrambling for your phone when someone goes quiet. Understanding is the map, not the territory. The territory is built through a different process. Accumulated choices that are actually yours, made from your own values rather than from anticipation of how they'll be received. Repeated experiences of holding a position under pressure and surviving the discomfort of someone's disagreement. The slow accumulation of self-knowledge that comes from being alone and honest and willing to look at what's actually there without immediately filtering it through how someone else would see it. There is a specific practice that accelerates this, and it is almost comically simple, which is why most people dismiss it. Ask yourself regularly and seriously, what do I actually think about this? Not what would be reasonable to think. Not what most people think. Not what the person whose opinion matters most to you would think. What do you, with your specific history and values and the particular texture of your experience, actually think? This sounds like it should be easy. For people with the mirror problem, it frequently isn't. The genuine answer is often not the first answer. The first answer is usually the performed one, the safe one, the palatable one, the one calibrated to approval. The genuine answer lives underneath that, and reaching it requires sitting with the question long enough for the performed answer to clear. When you find it, the actual thought, the real opinion, the genuine preference, say it. Not always out loud, sometimes just to yourself, but register it. Treat it as information worth having. Give it the weight you would give an opinion from someone you respect. You are someone you should respect. This is not affirmation. It is a structural requirement for the thing we've been discussing to work. The mirror problem resolves, not all at once, not completely, but substantially, when you become a more reliable source of information about yourself than other people are. When the question, "What do I think?" has an answer that arrives with some authority, before you've checked anyone else's face for clues. That shift changes everything downstream. The checking decreases. Not because you stop caring what others think, that would be its own dysfunction, but because their perception becomes one input among several rather than the primary source of a verdict you've been waiting your whole life to receive. The verdict, it turns out, was always going to have to come from you. Everyone else was just filling the silence while you avoided that fact. When you stop avoiding it, when you sit down with yourself honestly, without the noise, and start actually answering the question of who you are, and what you value, and what you will and will not accept from your one available life, the silence stops being threatening. It becomes the most useful room you've ever been in. Nobody arrives at self-respect cleanly. There is no version of this journey that is linear, dignified throughout, and free of moments where you look back at what you were doing and feel the particular embarrassment of someone who has just found the lights. The begging, the overgiving, the mirror problem, the careful management of yourself in rooms where you should have simply been present. None of it looks good in retrospect. It wasn't supposed to. It was survival dressed as love, and survival rarely looks graceful when examined after the fact. What matters is not how long the pattern ran. What matters is what you do from the moment you see it clearly. Here is what seeing it clearly actually means. Because clarity gets romanticized in ways that make it sound more complete than it is. Clarity does not mean the pattern disappears. It means you can see it arriving. The anxiety spike when someone goes quiet. You feel it and you recognize it. The urge to overgive when you sense distance. You notice the urge before you act on it. The impulse to edit yourself in the presence of someone whose approval feels important. You catch it in the moment rather than discovering it 3 years later when you're wondering where you went. That recognition is everything. Not because recognition stops the pattern immediately, because recognition creates the pause. And the pause, as this book has said in various ways across every chapter, is where freedom lives. You will still have moments of reaching. You will still, occasionally, send the message you should have held. You will still find yourself in certain rooms with certain people, performing a version of yourself that is slightly smaller than the real one. This is not failure. This is the texture of being human and working on something real. The difference is that you will know what you're doing. And knowing changes the relationship to the behavior, even when it doesn't immediately change the behavior itself. You are no longer unconscious. You are no longer running on a pattern you've mistaken for personality. You are someone who can see the mechanism, name it, and make a choice about what to do next. That choice, available to you now in a way it perhaps wasn't before, is the whole point. The person you are becoming is not a colder version of yourself, not more defended, not more armored, not less capable of the kind of love that costs something. You are becoming someone who can love from a full place rather than a frightened one. Someone whose generosity is real because it is chosen. Someone whose presence carries weight because it is not desperate. Someone who can be known, actually known, not the managed version, the real one, because they have stopped being afraid of what knowing might cost them. This is more vulnerable than the old pattern, not less. The old pattern was protection. Elaborate, exhausting, ultimately self-defeating protection, but protection nonetheless. What replaces it is openness, the genuine, unmanaged kind, which carries real risk. You can be hurt. You will be occasionally. The difference is that now you trust yourself to survive it. Not because you've become invulnerable, but because you've accumulated enough evidence that you are, in fact, the kind of person who survives things. You have always been that person. The pattern just convinced you otherwise. There is one last thing. This work is not finished when the book ends. It is not finished when the pattern first becomes visible, or when the first genuine boundary is set, or when the first relationship renegotiates into something more honest. It is ongoing, not as a project with a completion date, but as a way of being present to yourself that becomes, over time, less effortful and more simply how you live. You will have better weeks and worse ones. Relationships that test everything you've built, and relationships that feel, for the first time, like actual rest. Moments of complete clarity and moments of complete confusion that resolve eventually into something you can learn from. Through all of it, One thing remains constant and worth returning to whenever you've lost it. You are not here to beg for love. You were never here for that. You were here to participate in it as a whole person, with your actual needs and your actual limits and your actual wanting intact, in the kind of connection that doesn't require you to disappear as the price of admission. That connection exists. It is not a fantasy, and it is not reserved for people who had better starting conditions than you did. It is available to anyone who has done enough of this work to stop arriving at love as a question waiting to be answered. You have done enough of the work. You are doing it now. The rest follows from here.